Okay, carrying on with the book. This is the second part on August the 6th, 2026, of my book, We Are What We Learn. And so far, I've got through the first three skills, which are across the top there. And then I suppose they are traditionally the ones which historically we thought of in terms of perhaps intelligence or things that we look at in exams, learning, communication and cognition. We now move on to something which is a bit more unusual insofar as up there it's called, behind me if you can see it there, metacognition. This is self-awareness. This is a skill which is about who we are and how we relate to the world. We now know that this is something which we're not born with. We have to develop at a relatively young age, and unfortunately this is something which has probably been neglected over the years, because we are not able to understand ourselves very well unless we've had pretty good interaction and a good number of learning opportunities to really have a chance to work out how we see ourselves. And this is the essence of what I would classify as poor self-esteem, because if we have ways of looking at ourselves, which to some extent now has become a major issue, because in the past we'd looked at ourselves from how we were in our own particular village, our own particular family, our own particular even small towns. But now people have a bombardment at them from all sorts of things across the globe, and therefore how we look at ourselves is being hit one or right, left and centre. So the crucial thing is to bear in mind it's an assessment of how we assess ourselves. And if we were able to assess ourselves on these 8 skills, perhaps we would have a much better understanding of who we are as a human and where we are and what our strengths and weaknesses are. But sadly, often these days we are given such a lot of stuff, particularly on social media, which perhaps on TV I thought when I was born would be a big influence on this, and it certainly has. But now we have the internet causing so much harm. So we have vulnerable people. I used to say vulnerable young people, but they're pretty old now. And you can actually cause them to feel quite poor about themselves, because you are giving them a lot of information on which basically they're judging themselves rather than the stuff that really matters in what's important in their life. So the concept of trends and fashions and various people around them now mean that they are struggling. And this weakness in most people, I feel, is very much at the, and you will see this over these various podcasts, how this poor development in this area is actually now become a major issue in life. And this is true for the next one, because self-regulation or self-management, now that part of the brain which once upon a time was crucial in trying to, if you like, make us do things what we needed to do rather than what we wanted to do, is actually now poorly developed. And when babies are born, they're actually very poor in self-regulation. Their self-discipline, their self-control is very, very poor, and they need a lot of help, a lot of opportunity, lots of learning opportunities, learning experiences, in order to develop their ability to control their, shall I say, tempers, their paddies, or whatever you want to call it, trying to get what they want rather than actually what they need, and being able to develop the prefrontal cortex, which actually is crucial in our self-regulation, is absolutely crucial. And the poor development in this now, I would say, in my lifetime, has become a massive issue, because people who are well developed in this will not lose control and are not impulsive and manage to use their emotions effectively in a positive way. The trouble of it is that a lot of people, particularly young children, are actually struggling now. We have lots of different names for them when they are struggling in this. And I've been perhaps involved in this, in saying, we can describe this in lots of different ways. but the important thing is their behaviour is actually crucial in causing them to become perhaps very, very vulnerable. And they focus upon what they want, and rather than what they need, and are unable to avoid temptation, which was one of Oscar Wilde's great quotes. And therefore, one of the things which I discovered many years ago, there was a marshmallow test which operated in the 60s, but there is so much evidence now that we really need help in our early years in particular in developing this skill, and we have to learn to get what we need rather than what we want, and having to do without things which basically we feel automatically we would like but we shouldn't have. And this is where the next part comes into this, because you will see that in this area here we now have a thing which is now perhaps prevalent, is resilience. And our motivation now means that very often we will struggle to cope with difficulties and setbacks. We've had a huge rise in mental health problems in recent years. I became aware of it in the 70s when I started to teach and realised that there were a lot of kids out there who were very vulnerable, and their inability to cope with setbacks meant that they were very sensitive, and actually they hadn't developed resilience or persistence. My great hero when I was a child was Green Lantern, and the great thing about Green Lantern was that his willpower was what helped him overcome via his ring to overcome the difficulties. But I've seen over the years how crucial this is in success, that people with such poor willpower struggle, and they lack the responsibility to take control over their own actions, want to blame everybody else for their problems, and will look for excuses. In the 90s I came across a woman called Carol Dweck and her research, which she later refined, and it became fixed mindset and growth mindset. Fixed mindset is where people are looking to blame outward things, others, for their problems, whereas growth mindset, they look for their setbacks as a way of improving. Before that, I was looking at a thing called locus of control. That was in the late 80s and early 90s. Similar sort of thing from the psychology. Michael Rutter, I think, was the major responsible for that. But whatever it is, we've got to come to we've got to help children, young people, and people in general realise that until they look at themselves, and of course the 12 steps when you're dealing with people who are alcoholics, they very much focus on that. You've got to look to yourself and your own particular locus of control and realise that it's up to you if you're going to actually overcome problems. Babies are not born able to do that, and therefore the earlier we start to help them develop this growth mindset, the better we're going to be. The final two are crucial as far as dealing with other people, and the term empathy I came across in the mid to late 80s, and I realised that this was a crucial skill or development area that I hadn't realised how crucial it was. Because this is trying to see the eyes through the eyes of other people, and realising not everybody feels the same and reacts the same, and therefore being able to take into consideration how they look at life and how they feel is vital. In recent times we've seen a lot, and I'll come back to this, about this manosphere and femisphere and womansphere and how men, and in the 90s I realised that there was an issue in our society where I would use the phrase the future is female, largely because people couldn't realise that there was a big developmental problem in our society insofar as females weren't being treated in the way that they should have been, and we didn't seem to understand, or a lot of people didn't understand, how their skill levels and how they thought and felt were so vital in helping other people and leading other people. Nowadays we have a huge problem because there seems to be such a big split between men and women, perhaps in trying to categorise people rather than realising that they just happen to be part of what their development might be, and their development needs to understand. And this was my great weakness as a child. I never really understood about other girls because I didn't interact with them, so I didn't really understand how girls and women felt and thought until I was in my late 20s, 30s, and it was a big era in myself when I met my first wife, because I didn't realise how differently she saw the world and how unsuitable I was as a partner to her. And sadly, that's nearly not an uncommon problem. And we now have such wide diversity across the globe with the internet that people don't seem to grasp that there is this level of empathy that we need to have, and this problem with migration, or these way in which people see and mention discrimination and racism and so forth like that. Often they're ignorant. They don't know how other people and why other people feel the way they are. If they looked at their history and their background, they may have a much better understanding and have a better respect and care and consideration for them if they had a chance to do that. But we don't. Our society's not done that yet, and therefore we don't develop people's empathy very well at all. English possibly in the past has been able to do this a little bit, but very little of it has actually been the case. And now people have people called autists, or in the 40s it was Asperger's, but we now use phrases where people are struggling to cope with other people and diagnose them in that way, rather than trying to help them develop ways of looking at how other people think and feel. The final one is very much following on from that, and this is how we interact with other people. We now have such wide range of people that we come into contact with that we often struggle to understand and work with them effectively. When I was growing up in the 50s, I was born in East End of London, and many people felt and thought the same. But at the end of the day, by the time I'd become a teenager, this had changed dramatically, and I realised there was a huge range of people out there, and I didn't know how to interact with them, particularly women. And there were people I was coming across. Once I passed 11 plus, I met people who were from perhaps a middle class background, couldn't understand them at all, and therefore basically I had to develop the skills of trying to work with them, particularly when I became a teacher, but more importantly on the football field and rugby field, because I realised that if I was working with other people, I needed to not only get on with them, but actually to be able to help them and use their skills. And great teams are basically teams which have huge diversity but blend together, and how we pull those people together is how we make great leaders. And I began to realise that this was a crucial part of being a very effective leader. And so in the 80s and early 90s, I started to realise that I'd writing reports on people, and unfortunately the reports themselves weren't necessarily looking at the things that really matter. So I gradually developed ways of trying to assess people, and this is how I ended up in the early 90s assessing people, myself and anybody I came across, into those 8 categories that we have in front of them. And basically in my book I've tried to, if you like, put them down and been using them ever since. And you'll realise that if you do this on yourself, you'll have a much better chance of knowing how you are. Hence I finished this section. What do you now think we most need to learn to achieve good health, well-being and life chances? Perhaps go through those two podcasts again, and perhaps even look at the book and see if that will help you. I hope it does.